Our last speaker to the day is most well known for being the mother of my advisee, Martha.
Thank you, Rolf. It's wonderful to be here. I want you to know as I begin, I'm going to talk about wisdom. And I have a handout for you when you leave. It's a poem by Denise Levertov called The Beginning of Wisdom. It's in a lovely little book of her religious poetry called The Stream and the Sapphire. Do you know Denise Levertov, 20th century poet, came to faith fairly late in life, but a wonderful poet. And I think there's something of poetry in the kind of knowing that I'm going to talk about today. And I love this poem. I've prayed it many times. It's addressed to God. And I hope that you will enjoy that. I don't have time to talk about it during the presentation. Now, I say I'm going to talk about wisdom as a necessary and important, and I say indispensable element within faith formation. But it's very intimidating to say that you're going to talk about wisdom, because one of the first things that would characterize a person as wise is to know that they're not very wise, right? I think we heard a wise pastor yesterday in Laura Truax who said, there's so much I don't know, and I don't even know what I don't know. That is wisdom, and wisdom put to good generative purpose. But I also take courage from the remark of a 20th century Catholic philosopher, Gabriel Marcel, who said wisdom, in a sense, wisdom is indispensable from the pursuit of it. Simply to know that you yearn for wisdom is a step toward wisdom. Hence my title, Wise or Unwise. When our kids, including the aforementioned Martha, were growing up, my husband, who is a philosopher and a wit and a wonderful husband and father, he came up with a question which we often asked our children. He'd say, for example, Martha's brother gives his homework assignment really important to somebody who's a known slacker to turn in for him. It doesn't get there. He comes home, Mark says, John, was that wise or unwise? Okay. Was that wise or unwise? So many cases, they try to carry too much across the room to serve the table. It all spills. Was that wise or unwise? And of course, they loved it when they could turn it around on us. And ask, Mom, you were late to work, you forgot to fill the car. Was that wise or unwise? Of course, those are very small, kind of insignificant examples. But we hope that in raising the question of wisdom, not was that good or bad? Was that smart or dumb? Was that even faithful or unfaithful? Was that wise or unwise? To get them thinking about how we can learn from our experience, how we do learn from experience, to open a space of shared reflection about the things that we do and whether they're wise or unwise. And we hope that they would ultimately lead these young people to be wise about more important matters, like who to be a life partner with, how to manage your money, what calling to hear in the world. Wisdom, an everyday thing. I can't resist. Just one grandchild story. She was 3. She was sitting on my lap. We were reading Peter Rabbit. And Peter Rabbit was looking at that garden and thinking, I'm going to go into that garden. I said, Bisbee, is this wise or unwise? And she said, unwise. And I had no idea that this had been passed down already, but there it was. So, do you know that there is a widespread interest in wisdom in our society today? I think we even call it a widespread hunger. We as a species seem to have so much knowledge, so much information, but we don't know what to do with it. Right? We don't know how to live with it always, all this knowledge, all this information. T.S. Eliot, 20th century poet, who looked at a society that was obsessed with technology and production, and he saw a wasteland. And he asked this question, lifted up this hunger at the beginning of the choruses of the rock. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? In the modern era, which began, let's say, in the 17th century, peaked in the 19th and 20th centuries, but is still with us in many ways, specific understandings of what it means to know something have been dominant. Real knowledge is objective, and it's best achieved by a detached observer. Certainty, as opposed to ambiguity, nuance, mystery, our Lutheran favorite paradox, certainty is presumed to be a good thing. And the way to be certain is to give a rational proof. And this is what the new atheists are doing. You know, if you limit knowing to what is rationally, propositionally verifiable, and that's what it means to know, which is only what it is meant to know in the last 350 years of human history, okay? Well, then you can persuade people of your points. I know many of you are beyond this view of knowledge, but I do notice we seem to really like statistics. We talk about what's going on in our churches, those annual reports, the measurements. Rolf is telling us to measure the right things, not the wrong things, but measurement itself belongs most of the time to this kind of head knowledge that I'm talking about, this abstract, detached knowledge. And many of your congregation members do think that that's what it means to know something. I see this in my engineer father, you know, my late engineer father, who never quite could figure out the science-faith thing, you know, because there's this sense of what it means to know something. We saw something like this in a slightly different realm when David Lowe's talked about Suzuki and the difference between knowing by participation and knowing by being taught facts about music history or something, right? Facts about technique. And I sensed among us, as he advocated, a desire for more participatory kinds of knowing, even in the church, where all too often we do feed people information and head knowledge, rather than inviting them into participatory knowledge. So are there ways of knowing the world, ourselves, and our neighbors that have more nuance and depth and compassion than the ways that are most prized in a technical, science-driven society? This is partly where wisdom comes in, I think. And I'm going to argue by the end of this that the church really knows something about wisdom, and that we need to be fostering this in ourselves, our own people, and showing it to the world. But another example of the hunger in the world, which I think will help us understand what wisdom is. Strong interest, big conversations about wisdom in the fields of nursing and medicine. Do you know this? And it's kind of obvious if you think about it. And here we're not saying that modern scientific knowledge is bad, because these people we see here are possessed of many of the fruits of science, which were won by objective, rational study of their predecessor scientists and of themselves. Evidence-based medicine, double-blind testing, critical studies of outcomes. This is very important and very helpful, and you kind of need to stand back and have that kind of knowledge to do those things. Nurses and physicians spend years mastering that kind of knowing, and they will continue to learn science and read journals and gather more data throughout their careers. But you know where I'm going with this. That's not all they need, right? They also need wisdom. A good practitioner needs to be sensitive to the needs and character and capabilities of the specific people, the specific person before him or her. A good practitioner needs to be able to read a situation astutely, to notice little tells, little things that might suggest that maybe there's some abuse in this situation, right? Or that there's a cultural issue going on that we haven't yet understood, or that there's something else that the patient wants to tell us. A good practitioner is flexible and adaptive. They know lots of rules, but if they only follow rules, they'll probably go wrong some of the time. There's a wonderful study in this whole wisdom literature of the U.S. Forest Service. They developed like 50 rules to follow if you're a firefighter out in a forest fire. And it was costing people their lives, because when you're in a situation of crisis, you can't remember all the rules. You have to have a flexible kind of embodied knowledge. So they cut the rules back to 5 and practiced them over and over with their bodies, and people got better. People got better, okay? Another really important characteristic of this kind of practical wisdom, a sense of proportion. A medical provider looking at a patient needs to understand this symptom needs to be looked at before that one, right? This is more important than that. Or in other realms of life, I might say they have their eyes on the prize. They know what matters most. This is something we talked about over dinner last night. What matters most when we proclaim the gospel? And they also have a sense of what health looks like, right? They know what health is. They have a goal, an aim. They need to be pursuing a good purpose for us to call them wise. When they enter a critical situation, they can't go through all the rules, remember all the science. By the time they are fully educated and trained, they've seen lots and lots of cases. They've sedimented the learning from all of those cases. It's become part of them, and they know how to walk into the room and do the right thing most of the time, right? There still are always going to be surprises. They typically learn in the company of mentors. The wisdom comes to be lodged in their bodies. And good pastors have this too, right? And so I've heard people talk about, well, the first funeral I did, go to the book, look it all up, follow the rules you learned in seminary. A little awkward, right? Next one, perhaps learn from that experience. And finally, when you're called to a place where someone has died, you walk in the room and you know what to do. And it's different every time, and part of it is the particularity and the sensitivity. That's part of what practical wisdom is. But there's an adaptivity, a flexibility, a sensitivity which comes with practical wisdom. One's emotions are involved in an appropriate way, and the knowledge is lodged in the body. It's the kind of knowing that's like that you can use to walk around the neighborhood rather than to draw the map. Okay? And I really think that this kind of knowing, this ability to move into a place of suffering, is part of what it means to be formed in Christian faith for all of us, lay people and pastors and other church leaders. This kind of knowing that is in our bodies, that's not just in our heads, it's written on the heart. Don't stop and remember all the verses every time. After a life of faith, participation in faith community, it's just there. So, let me propose, as I said, wisdom as a theme and goal of faith formation. I'm obviously very far from the first to do this. All wisdom literature, including that in Scripture, in our tradition and in others, has this purpose. Wisdom communities existed in order that wisdom would thrive, would grow, would be passed on to others. It's all over the book of Proverbs, this intergenerational place of wisdom. Hear, my child, your father's instruction. Do not reject your mother's teaching. But if we are to think of this as a dimension of the life of faith, this kind of everyday practical wisdom that's in our bodies is only one dimension of it. To be wise is not only to live wisely, right? In faith, wisdom also involves encounters with God beyond all our human wisdom. all our learned experience, right? That upends, that overturns. This is a picture of Job. Do you know this famous, I think it's a watercolor by William Blake? Job has said to the whirlwind, "Answer me, I demand an answer for my sufferings." And the voice of God speaks from the whirlwind. So this is one of the wisdom images of William Blake, who was an early 19th century English poet and artist who was very troubled by the wisdom we have lost in knowledge. He was very troubled by the rise of the technological society and trying to reclaim wisdom. And he wanted to say that God's wisdom upends us, overturns us, humbles us in the face of all of our human knowledge, and leaves us all speechless, even the most wise pastor, the most wise physician. These encounters simultaneously disclose who God is and hide from us some of what we wish we would know. If you recall, this would be Job 38, and the voice from the whirlwind would be saying, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the world?" Right? Job is being introduced to, and then the voice goes on for 4 more chapters about all the wonders of creation, all the creatures that pay no attention to us human beings, all the creative power of God, which is far beyond the things that Job had previously been concerned about. And Job is dislodged from the center of things, dislodged and overcome by the presence of God. Faithful living will still be his calling, but now in a new way, because its backdrop is awareness of the all-surpassing character of God and the limits of human knowing. And probably the key text, one of the most cited texts about wisdom in Scripture, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight." So I'm talking about 2 different kinds of wisdom. I'm heading to a point where I hope I can argue that faith formation is going to include both of those and bring them together. A generation ago, I see now, it was that Walter Brueggemann, whom you know as a biblical scholar and preacher, and who also did a PhD in education after he was already an Old Testament professor, so interested in church education, wrote a book called The Creative Word, and he argued that the shape of the Old Testament canon, the process by which a diversity of kinds of literature had been brought together with a variety of emphases about the life of faith and what it means to live with and under God. And these books were different kinds of books that were recognized as authoritative and necessary to faith. That if we look at the shape of character, we can see a guide to what's needed in church education. And I think also now we use the language of faith formation. One dimension is Torah. He says Torah lays down the ethos of community, the identity-shaping narrative. And this we have encountered several times among the various speakers, the importance of getting the grounding story, the identity-shaping story. And here I think Brueggemann means not so much law as such, but rather those first 5 books of Moses that set forth the identity-shaping narrative. And so one dimension of faith formation is, as so many have said here, is to lay down that story. But another is prophecy, another large portion of the canonical scripture, which expresses what Brueggemann calls the pathos of God and Israel, the yearning for justice, the awareness of the gap between how things are and how things should be, the wrath and brokenheartedness that arise within the fracture and abrasions that exist in our world. And this aspect of church education, faith formation, which we have not really discussed a great deal here, but I would suppose that in your churches there is this awareness of the brokenness of our world, and many people who are deeply committed to service and testimony that would seek to make God's justice and mercy more real in our world, who are convicted by the words of the prophet and honest about our failings as a society. And the third surprise is wisdom, which Brueggemann calls the logos operative in God's world. The conviction that there is sense and order and meaning in life, and that we can grow towards harmony with the way things are. And this, I think, is like those practical wisdom pieces I was talking about at first, the ability to read the situation and to be in tune with the healing process that's needed. But also, at the inbreaking of God, the mystery, the things that we will never know, the place at the foot of the whirlwind, the humility before God, which also belongs to the wisdom literature. Now, Brueggemann has introduced these three categories, partly because he's very concerned about the challenge of simultaneously transmitting the tradition and keeping it open. And we have talked a great deal about transmitting the tradition in this conference, and occasionally about keeping it open. But these are both really important parts of faith formation, I think, to be able to really know that story and to be surprised at where it grabs us and how it shows up. Be surprised at what God is still doing in the world. But I want to introduce also, this is a creative tension in a sense. I want to introduce another creative tension, which seems to me really belongs to faith formation in this time. And that is awareness that we live on God's vast horizon. I mean, encounters with God. The humble moment of realizing that there is God, that God is holy, that we are convicted by our own humility and sin, but also wisdom as care for the particular, the concrete, the ordinary. And isn't this what we are called to be, in a sense, to both be attuned to the vastness, the cosmic wisdom of God, and to be living right alongside one another in the midst of a world of suffering and complexity and opportunity. So wisdom of this kind, I suppose, and wisdom of this kind. Do you recognize this picture by Vermeer reminds me of the virtuous woman in Proverbs, who would be one of the sort of practical wisdom figures in Scripture. But it's a burgher's wife in Holland in the 18th century, going about her daily work. She has a balance in her hand. And you see what's on the picture in the background? The Last Judgment, right? So here's a person going about her household duties in awareness of God's overarching promise and demand, and living out her life within the concrete, particular, nearby world that she is given. So, Rolf asked for vital signs of faith formation, and I guess I have two to offer here. One is a sign would be awe and reverence. Awe and reverence, which are missing capacities in our culture, I think. Apart from the awesome that, for a certain kind of spectacle, right? And Roger Nishioka challenged us to, he gave us the fact, I suppose, that many young people who continue to be convicted and engaged in their faith say that they have had experiences of God. And we can lift those up. We can't make them happen, but we can lift them up and help people to recognize them when they are happening by introducing them to stories in which they happen, which Scripture is full of, and by telling our own stories of when this has happened to us. helping that to be part of the articulated awareness of the people who we seek to serve as midwives in their faith formation. Now for me, I'm a liturgy person, okay? I just love good liturgy. And I grew up in a very dry, very moral, pretty left-wing, low church Protestant situation, Reformed, liberal Reformed, okay? And when I encountered Lutheranism, it knocked my socks off. All these colors, really, and the changing seasons, and even the people would be so respectful as to wear albs, you know, and the gestures. It really knocked my socks off, and I still love it. I think I went through about a 5-year period whenever I was having any kind of spiritual difficulties, I just trained myself to go straight to the fire of the Easter Vigil, which was kindled at a certain place on our campus, which I walked past every day, and which just seemed to me the best image of God I'd ever known, okay? Now, some people don't get it with the liturgy, okay? I realize this, or not yet. But perhaps they have had other kinds of experiences. And here, there is a calling in our society, I think, for silence. Okay? There are a lot of people who are really hungry for silence and spending time in silent retreat, just to turn off the noise, all the information, as Eliot would call it. Okay? Usually, it doesn't, just because you're in a room and not talking doesn't mean that the noise goes off in your head. That takes training and time. But I think there are people working in faith formation who can help you and your congregations and those who are interested learn to be silent. Learn to listen. This is hard, especially it's related to what Deanna was talking about, the distractions of the virtual age. But awe and reverence is it's the human capacity. And it might just be be shriveling up within us under current conditions. And it's one thing that we can think, one dimension of wise faith formation. And another dimension is embodied practice in everyday life. Now, I've been working a lot on practices for many years, and think practices like hospitality and forgiveness and generosity. And one reason I became interested in practical wisdom was asking, what do you need to know? Who do you need to be in order to engage faithfully in practices such as hospitality? Okay? You need to be practically wise. You need to be able to discern how to negotiate wide open generosity with a certain kind of budget frugality, okay? You need to know how to be attentive to the specific needs of this particular stranger who has come your way. You need to, I'm getting a little more on that later. But this combination of awe and reverence and embodied participatory wise service in daily life is where I'm going as the two dimensions that wisdom can bring to faith formation. And it's these two dimensions held together. Where are they best held together? Of course, another picture, this one's Caravaggio of the dinner at Emmaus. But we as Christians encounter God not just in the whirlwind, obviously, but in Jesus Christ, who embodies, and one of whose names is wisdom of God. Logos, with God before creation, is a wisdom term. But also carpenter's son from Nazareth, right? Lord of all creation, the cosmic Christ of Colossians, and also simultaneously one who embraces the everyday world of lost coins and lost sheep and lepers in need of healing. embodied, particular, and eternal. It's the kind of life we're called into as we put on Christ. But also, as we saw it with Job, there's so often an overturning of the world's wisdom in Jesus' wisdom. And Paul says this, the cross is a folly. The vineyard workers all get paid the same, whether they start early or late. It does not comport with the world's wisdom. So there's also a countercultural element of this kind of wisdom that I'm advocating. So on the one hand, awe and reverence, on the other, embodied practice in everyday life. I think that the catechumenate ministry, do you know the catechumenate, the preparation for baptism, which is a very widespread model of faith formation now, which really does a lot with liturgical, lots of oil, lots of water, lots of fire, lots of preparation to really enter the church in a baptism that is awe-inspiring, as the ancient fathers called that night of Easter baptism. But also, one gets a mentor with whom one talks about, how shall I live out this faith today? Also, the embodied practice in the nearby situation. So both of those are the elements of faith formation. I'm getting near the end of my time, but let me lift up this image as one that speaks a great deal to me, and apparently to this seminary. This is the work of John August Swanson, and it's hanging all over the seminary, I've noticed. Here's a detail which makes it a little more clear. It's called A Village. John August Swanson, the contemporary artist. A village. And this village is clothed with stories, okay? Here we are, and I see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over on the side dancing. Elijah is going up to heaven in the chariot of fire. There's water. The person drawing the village water, it's coming out of a rock, right? Isaac is being saved from being sacrificed as an angel appears right in the middle. This whole village is clothed with the stories of Scripture. And our speaker this morning, the gentleman, said, I heard him saying afterwards, wisdom is knowing which story to tell when. Okay? So the story is enmeshed in daily life, but they're also doing all the things of everyday life as right in the midst of the picture. I think weaving those stories into daily life, knowing when to tell what story, is really, really crucial. And it takes a certain amount of practical wisdom, knowing the people you're talking to, and so on. Just one example, I had twins. And do you know how many stories of jealous siblings there are in Scripture? Right? Somebody feels like they're having to work harder than the other one. Well, let me tell you about these two sisters who lived in Bethany. Or somebody, why is that person getting all the attention? Well, did you ever hear about the man who had two sons? You can really do this, and we did. But anyway, this image here makes me think of those in my congregation who do, for example, serve in our congregation's homeless shelter. Take some practical wisdom. Do we follow the rules every time? Are we flexible sometimes? Right? How do we be open and also think of safety? You know these issues, and it takes wisdom. And it takes wisdom to be a parent, it takes wisdom to be a pastor. And this is part of faith formation. But notice at the very bottom of the picture, the tall picture, for the very bottom, the visit which is at stake is the visit of the Annunciation. Not one angel, but three have shown up to tell Mary, who is there serving in the kitchen, that she will have a child. And so this is the ground of all the other wisdom. Aren't these the kind of characteristics that you wish to have, and I think sometimes have trouble finding, You're looking for adults to go along on the mission trip with the youth, for example. I mean, there's a lot of practical wisdom, but you also hope that they can help the youth notice God's presence. It's contextual, imaginative, and embodied, lived out in the body. How is this going to happen? Well, my hunch is that there are people among you in every congregation who have this kind of wisdom, who are just terrific with 4-year-olds, are really sensitive at visiting the sick, who have a kind of wisdom which you could get them to share. I think that you have it yourself. And I would lift up that kind of wisdom and name it and honor it and notice it. Because so often that kind of activity, that kind of practicing, just becomes busyness, just is work. And I'd say it's wisdom. But also, whenever you can, again and again, lift up that other kind of wisdom, the awe and reverence, the reminder that we all live on God's vast horizon, and that our efforts, no matter how wise in a practical sense, always depend upon and are overshadowed by and illumined by God's presence and grace. Thanks.